What if one of the most important waterways on Earth just sent a warning to the entire global economy and almost nobody noticed? Tonight on Redline Report, we're looking at a development in the Strait of Hormuz that could carry consequences far beyond the Middle East. By some counts, normal ship movement through Hormuz appeared to collapse from around 100 vessels to just 5 inches a shock window that should have triggered alarm bells everywhere from Washington to London to Beijing. And if that kind of drop holds, even briefly, this is not just a regional security story. This is an oil story, a shipping story, an inflation story, and potentially a global recession story. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another narrow stretch of water on the map. It is one of the most important choke points in the world economy. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil trade passes through it. Massive volumes of LNG move through it. Gulf economies depend on it. Asian energy markets depend on it. European price stability depends on it. And if vessel movement there really drops off a cliff, the message is simple. The world may be much more vulnerable than it wants to admit. So tonight, we break down what a collapse from 100 ships to 5 could actually mean. Why this matters far beyond Iran and the Gulf. Why insurance markets and oil traders watch Hormuz like a heartbeat monitor, and why a quiet disruption there can become a loud global crisis faster than most people realize. Because sometimes the biggest geopolitical shock is not the missile strike everyone sees. It is the traffic that suddenly disappears. Let's start with the obvious question. Why does Hormuz matter so much? Because if you wanted to design the single most dangerous bottleneck in the global energy system, it would look a lot like this. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, heavily watched, militarized, and strategically exposed. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then to the Arabian Sea. That means oil exported from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and other Gulf producers often has to move through this corridor. That is why every war scare, every drone incident, every tanker seizure, every naval standoff, and every missile launch in or around Hormuz instantly becomes a global concern. This is not abstract. If disruption there lasts long enough, shipping schedules break down, insurance premiums spike, tanker operators hesitate, energy traders panic, governments begin contingency calls, and markets start pricing in fear long before physical shortages actually hit. That is why the number in this story is so important. 100 ships to 5. Even if that figure reflects a short, high-stress window rather than a long-term average, the symbolism is still powerful. Because shipping is one of the cleanest, real-time indicators of fear in the system. Ships move when owners, insurers, operators, and governments believe the route is still worth the risk. Ships stop, delay, reroute, or bunch up when the risk suddenly looks unacceptable. And that is the real meaning of a shipping collapse. It means the market is no longer asking, can the ship get through? It is asking, what happens if it doesn't? That is a very different level of fear. Now, if you are watching this from the United States, it can be tempting to think this is mainly a Gulf problem, or mainly a Middle East problem, or mainly a military problem. That would be a mistake, because Hormuz is where geopolitics meets daily life. When traffic through that choke point falls, the first shock may appear in freight calculations and insurance tables. But it never stays there. It moves into energy prices. It moves into manufacturing costs. It moves into food transport. It moves into airline fuel. It moves into consumer inflation. In other words, a quiet crisis at sea can end up showing up in places most people would never connect to the Strait of Hormuz at all. That is the danger. The public often waits for a dramatic image before it realizes something serious is happening: a burning tanker, a missile impact, a naval clash, a presidential address. But by the time those images arrive, the economic system may already be reacting. That is why the shipping number matters so much, because it may be the first sign that the private actors in the system, the people who actually move oil, insure cargo, route vessels, and carry risk, have already become more alarmed than the public conversation suggests. And once private risk models turn, events can accelerate quickly. Let's talk about the oil angle, because this is where the stakes become impossible to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz carries a huge share of the world's seaborne oil exports. In some estimates, around 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption moves through this zone. That means even a temporary disruption can create an outsized reaction in the market. Oil does not need to disappear completely for prices to surge. Traders only need to believe that supply might be constrained, delayed, or endangered. Fear alone can move price. Risk alone can move price. Uncertainty alone can move price. And once prices rise, political pressure rises with them. You start hearing about strategic reserves. You start hearing about rerouting capacity. You start hearing about alternative pipelines. You start hearing about Gulf vulnerability. And very quickly, what looked like a military standoff becomes an economic stress test for the entire world. This is why Hormuz is so powerful. It turns geography into leverage. Iran understands that. The Gulf monarchies understand that. The United States understands that. China understands that. Everyone understands that. Because in a conventional military comparison, Iran does not need to outgun the United States ship for ship, plane for plane, or base for base. It only needs to convince the world that the cost of moving safely through the choke point is no longer predictable. That is enough to shake the whole structure. And this is where a lot of commentators miss the bigger story. They focus only on whether a war starts or whether a war does not start. But the real contest is often more subtle than that. The real contest is about control of pressure. Who can make the other side feel exposed? Who can make the cost of normal operations rise? Who can turn uncertainty into strategic leverage? That is why a drop from 100 ships to 5 is not just a transportation statistic. It is a sign that the system itself may be recoiling. Now step back and think about the wider strategic picture. If vessel traffic in Hormuz falls that sharply, even for a short period, what does it tell the world? It tells the world that the most protected energy corridor on Earth is still vulnerable. It tells the world that U.S. naval power does not automatically erase market fear. It tells the world that a regional confrontation can still disrupt global trade without a formal declaration of all-out war. And perhaps most importantly, it tells the world that a handful of minutes, hours, or days of tension in the Gulf can send a shock through a system built on assumptions of flow, speed, and continuity. That is why this matters to empires, alliances, and currencies. Because modern power is not just about winning battles, it is about keeping systems open. Open sea lanes, open energy flows, open financial confidence, open commercial predictability. If you can no longer guarantee those things, then your influence looks weaker, even if your military is still the strongest in the world. That is the deeper danger here for Washington. America's role in the Gulf has never been only about direct military superiority. It has also been about reassurance, reassuring allies, reassuring markets, reassuring shipping firms, reassuring energy buyers, reassuring investors that the map may look dangerous, but the arteries of the system will keep moving. If traffic suddenly collapses anyway, that reassurance takes a hit. And once reassurance cracks, even temporarily, the whole region starts recalculating. The Gulf states start asking harder questions about vulnerability. Asian importers start asking harder questions about dependence. European policymakers start asking harder questions about energy resilience. And rivals start asking whether American power looks bigger in headlines than it does in chokepoint reality. That is why a quiet shipping shock can be so politically dangerous, because it becomes a test of credibility. Let's make this more tangible. Imagine a major highway that carries food, fuel, medicine, and industrial goods to multiple countries. Now imagine that highway is suddenly so dangerous that traffic collapses by 95%. Even if the road is not physically destroyed, the effect is almost the same. The flow stops. The risk premium explodes. Everyone upstream and downstream begins adjusting. Warehouses prepare for delays. Buyers overpay for certainty. Sellers scramble to protect contracts. And governments begin planning for second-order effect. That is what Hormuz is to the global energy economy. It is a maritime highway with consequences far beyond the water itself. Now, one of the most important parts of this story is something most casual viewers never think about: marine insurance. Insurance is often where geopolitics becomes brutally real. You can have political leaders saying the situation is under control. You can have spokespeople insisting that trade continues. But insurers do not respond to political slogans. They respond to risk calculations. If the risk of missile attack rises, premiums rise. If the risk of seizure rises, premiums rise. If the risk of naval confrontation rises, premiums rise. And if the risk becomes too high, insurers may refuse coverage entirely or charge so much that movement becomes economically irrational. That means shipping can freeze not only because a ship gets hit, but because the price of sending it becomes unbearable. That is why Hormuz matters in a way many people underestimate. It is not only about physical closure, it is about functional intimidation. A route can remain technically open while becoming strategically half-paralyzed. And that may be the most dangerous kind of disruption of all, because it happens quietly. No dramatic declaration, no obvious blockade, no giant banner saying global trade has entered a crisis. Just fewer ships, higher premiums, longer delays, higher prices, more fear. And then one day people look around and realize the economic consequences are already here. This is also why the phrase, "nobody is talking about it," resonates so strongly. Because a lot of the biggest signals in geopolitics do not arrive as emotional speeches. They arrive as patterns. They arrive as missing activity. They arrive as sudden changes in movement, cost, and behavior. They arrive in data before they arrive in headlines. And by the time the headlines fully catch up, the market may already be far ahead. Now let's zoom out even more. What does a Hormuz disruption mean for Iran's strategy? It means leverage. Iran does not need to defeat the U.S. Navy in a cinematic war to make its point. It does not need to sink carriers or occupy Gulf capitals. It only needs to demonstrate that under conditions of crisis, the world's most critical energy corridor becomes unstable enough to make everybody nervous. That alone changes calculations. It raises the cost of pressure campaigns. It complicates allied unity. It creates hesitation in markets. It reminds Washington that escalation in the Gulf never stays neatly local. That is why the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most powerful strategic tools in the region. It compresses geography, economics, and military vulnerability into one narrow band of water. And that is why every serious power watches it. Because whoever can threaten the flow there does not just threaten ships. They threaten assumptions. The assumption that oil will move. The assumption that energy markets will stay calm. The assumption that military deterrence automatically protects commercial normalcy. The assumption that global growth can be insulated from regional conflict. That is what starts breaking when traffic disappears. And if you want to understand why this matters so much politically, look at what happens next in democracies when energy fear rises. Fuel prices become a domestic issue. Inflation becomes a domestic issue. Supply chain instability becomes a domestic issue. Central banks come under pressure. Governments lose political room. Voters stop seeing the crisis as over there. That is why chokepoint disruption is so effective. It translates distant tension into local consequence. This is also where China enters the conversation, whether people want to admit it or not. China is one of the world's biggest energy importers and a massive buyer of Gulf crude. That means instability in Hormuz is not only a Middle East story or a U.S. story. It is a story about Asian energy security, industrial continuity, and global competition between major powers. If Hormuz becomes unreliable, countries do not only panic, they rethink routes, they rethink suppliers, they rethink strategic reserves, they rethink partnerships. And every rethink is geopolitical. So when people say this is just another Gulf flare-up, they are missing the scale of the issue. Hormuz is not just a Gulf flare-up. Hormuz is a global pressure valve. And if the valve starts sticking, the whole system feels it. Now, let's talk about the narrative battle, because this is where modern geopolitical crises really get shaped. If traffic collapses and the world starts whispering about vulnerability, who wins the narrative? Iran can say, look, we do not need to conquer anyone. We only need to remind the world where the pressure points are. The United States can say, this is exactly why our presence in the region is necessary. The Gulf states can say, our survival depends on keeping these routes open. Markets can say, we do not care who is right, we care who can keep oil moving. And in the end, markets may be the most honest judge of all. Because markets strip away speeches and slogans and ask one brutal question, do you trust the flow? If the answer becomes no, everything else starts moving with it. That is why I think the shipping number matters so much. 100 ships to 5 is not just a number designed to scare people. It is a warning sign about confidence. A collapse like that suggests hesitation entered the bloodstream of the system. And hesitation in a choke point like Hormuz is never a minor event. It is a signal flare. And if this is a signal flare, then the lesson is bigger than one day's shipping data. The lesson is that the modern global economy still depends on a small number of geographic choke points that can shake the world if they stop feeling safe. We built a system that looks vast, diversified, and technologically advanced. But under pressure, it can still become hostage to narrow passageways, regional conflict, and military risk. That is not a sign of strength. That is a sign of fragility. And fragility is what empires fear most, because fragility turns confidence into doubt. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a hard truth. Something devastating may have happened in Hormuz, not because every ship was destroyed, not because a formal closure was declared, but because the sudden disappearance of traffic may have revealed how quickly fear can overpower normality in one of the world's most critical waterways. That matters. It matters for oil. It matters for inflation. It matters for shipping. It matters for energy security. It matters for the credibility of deterrence. And it matters because the next stage of the crisis may not begin with a headline. It may begin with another quiet sign that the system is pulling back again. So here is the takeaway. When ships stop moving in Hormuz, the world should pay attention immediately. Because by the time politicians start calling it a major crisis, the markets may have already decided it is one. And if traffic really fell from 100 to 5, then the most dangerous part of this story may not be what happened on the water. It may be what that collapse revealed about the world behind it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to Redline Report, leave your view in the comments, and tell me this. Is Hormuz sending an early warning of a much bigger global shock, or is the world still underestimating how fast this choke point can trigger the next energy crisis?